All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to those of you in the room, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I'm Virginia Davis with the National Congress of American Indians, and we're here today at the Carter Center with leading tribal, state, and federal policymakers, academics, and practitioners talking about Native American participation in elections. Exercising the right to vote has a long and complicated history for American Indians and Alaska Natives, as we've all heard today. Historically, Native Americans have participated at lower rates than other groups in the United States. We've had robust discussions already today in the room about the many barriers that Native voters confront when trying to register to vote and cast their ballots. We've heard about the long distances to polling places, the language barriers, the harassment and intimidation, and other issues that Native voters frequently confront. On this panel, we're going to shift our focus to hear about some of the best practices for encouraging participation. We're going to talk about what is working, because we know that there's a lot that is working. On election night 2018, we saw tremendous victories in Indian country celebrated across the country. Despite the many systemic barriers and sometimes overt efforts to suppress the Native vote, Native turnout was up significantly in many places. We also had a record number of Native candidates running and winning their elections for office. Indian country will be sending the first 2 Native women to Congress in January, where they will join the 2 Native men who were reelected to their seats in the House of Representatives. This still is far from being proportionate representation. We think we need 2 in the Senate and 7 in the House, so we have a ways to go, but it's progress and we're celebrating it. We're also seeing progress at the state level. Oklahoma's new governor is a tribal citizen, and so is Minnesota's new lieutenant governor, Peggy Flanagan. Nearly 50 American Indians and Alaska Natives were elected to state legislatures across the country. And one of my personal favorite stories among those candidates is Ruth Ann Buffalo. We've talked today about the really stringent and oppressive voter identification law in North Dakota that had a disproportionate impact on Native voters in that state. Well, the state legislator who had sponsored that law was defeated by a tribal citizen, Ruth Ann Buffalo, who will be taking his seat and was sworn in recently in her full tribal regalia, and it's a picture that we all were very glad to see around Indian country. While the overall number of Native voters may be small, we know it's also big enough to make a difference in key races. Analysts have concluded that Native voters played a decisive role in close congressional races this year in Arizona, New Mexico, and Montana. So one of the clear takeaways from the 2018 election is the growing importance of the Native electorate in U.S. elections, both as voters and as candidates. And those of us who work in Indian country and who work on tribal issues, we know that this matters. When Native people are in decision-making roles, Native issues, which have often been neglected for decades, get more attention. Dan this morning was talking about the intersection between economic development and voting, and he posited that we need that those 2 things are inextricably linked. And I would agree, although I think it's a bit of a feedback loop. We need to have an empowered Native electorate to help create the circumstances for economic development on the reservations, and that's true for all of the other issues that we care about as well. At my organization, the National Congress of American Indians, we're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. NCAI is an organization that was established by tribal leaders who recognized the need for a forum where they could bring their voices together to advocate for Indian country. NCAI was founded in 1944, which was right in the heart of what those of us who work in this area know as the Termination Era. It was a time when the stated policy of the federal government was to terminate Indian tribes, to dissolve their governmental structures in existence, and to fully assimilate Native peoples into the general population once and for all. Fortunately, they weren't successful in doing that. The tribal leaders realized at that time the importance of unity and standing together and making their voices heard. When they came to Denver in 1944 to establish the National Congress of American Indians, in addition to adopting the Constitution that still governs our work today, they also passed a handful of resolutions. And one of the first resolutions that they passed that year in their inaugural Congress addressed the franchise for Native Americans. A tribal delegate from Arizona, brought that resolution to the body because he was concerned that American Indians in New Mexico and Arizona were being disenfranchised. The delegates all debated that resolution. They shared their own stories of disenfranchisement, and they ultimately amended his proposed resolution to make it national in scope and adopted it unanimously. Our work at NCAI has been focused on protecting and promoting voting rights for Native Americans ever since, and we are really honored and gratified to be a part of such an amazing coalition, many of the members of which are represented here in the room today, continuing that work. At NCAI, today we largely do that work through our nonpartisan Native Vote initiative. The backbone of the Native Vote effort at NCAI is a network of Native Vote coordinators across the country. They're the ones who are on the ground in tribal communities doing grassroots organizing and mobilizing work. We support them in their work by providing resource materials, trainings, and most importantly, this is kind of the cornerstone of what we do at NCAI, of creating a forum for them to share best practices and ideas with one another. We often aren't doing the work, we're supporting those who do, and it's a real honor to see what they've been able to accomplish in their tribal communities. In 2018, we worked with over 150 Native Vote coordinators across the country. Some are working with individual tribes, some are working at a regional or statewide level. But organizing and mobilizing voters is only part of the equation. We need tribal voters to be educated and motivated to vote, but we also need for them to be able to have their vote counted when they decide that they want to. And as we've talked about today, it's simply harder in many cases for tribal citizens to vote than it is for others. And it's harder than it should be. And I'm really excited to be here with this group today brainstorming about solutions and how we can begin to make that less true. Native voters often have to travel long distances both to register and to vote. They encounter intimidation or harassment. They may encounter problems trying to vote in their indigenous languages or using their tribal identification cards. We've talked about all of those issues here today. We work to create a space for tribal leaders to talk with one another and learn from each other, as I said. And one of the conversations I've been most excited about the past couple of years is about the need for our tribal governments as governments to play more of a role in election administration. And I know I'm sitting in a room full of election administrators who who may be interested in what I have to say next about that, and I'm really excited to have that conversation with you all as well. Obviously, our tribal governments are administering their own elections. They're administering their tribal elections. But in the United States, the way our system is set up, federal governments, the federal election is generally the responsibility of state and local election administration officials. The tribes, as governments, with a government-to-government relationship with the federal government, are largely shut out of that process. And we view that as a root of some of the systemic barriers that are making it harder for Native citizens to vote. When tribal governments, when their governments are shut out of election administration decisions, we think that has the predictable result of creating an uneven playing field for Native voters who live in their communities. And we've seen in recent years more and more tribal governments reaching out to their counterparts, to ask, to sometimes demand through litigation that their citizens have equal access to polling places, to voter registration, and the ability to participate in the election system. We've talked a little bit about this today. We recognize that we cannot litigate our way out of this problem. It's too expensive for everybody. It damages rather than builds relationships on the ground. And it's not going to be a solution that's available nationally. It's not going to solve all of our problems. It's an important tool, but we also recognize the importance of building partnerships and building relationships between the states and tribes, between counties and tribes, and using diplomacy is another really important tool in our tool belt. I mean, I think what we've been talking about today are solvable problems. These are, some of them are more challenging than others, but they are solvable problems if people have the will to solve them. And the fact that we're all here in this room is a great start in telling me that we do have the will to solve them. I want to talk a little bit about Nevada. We've talked about it some already, but it's a great example, I think, of the kinds of, the way all of this can fit together. In Nevada, they have, you saw some slides earlier today, those of you that are in the room, of exceptionally long distances to polling places on some of the reservations in Nevada. In 2016, several of the tribes requested early voting sites on their reservations from their state election administration officials. And those were denied. A couple of the tribes then filed a lawsuit, and they were successful. And so in 2016, they had early voting on those reservations for the first time. I'm now talking about things that the experts are in the room around the table, and so I ask their indulgence as I summarize their work, probably not as well as they would. But Professor Shodell took a look at what happened in Nevada. The litigation created this, as she calls it in her research, kind of a natural experiment, right? Where we had reservations who through litigation secured early vote, other reservations who had similar turnout rates who did not join the litigation and so did not have early vote in that same election. And so they were able to compare what happened, does it really make a difference? And she found that on the reservations that had secured early voting locations through the litigation, turnout was up between 11 and 24%. So it was an intervention that was tremendously successful. But I said we're not going to litigate our way out of this problem, right? So one of my favorite parts of the Nevada story is that the following year, the state legislature passed legislation creating a framework for tribes to request polling places and early voting locations on their reservation. They recognized the need to reform, the need to partner with the tribes, and this year we had even more tribal communities who made that request and had access on their reservations for the first time. At NCAI, we are uniquely positioned in our work with the tribal leaders to try and help share these ideas with them, to help equip them with the information and the encouragement they need to be good partners and to come to the table with the state election administration officials. And we are going to continue prioritizing doing that, and I look forward to talking to you more about it. We've also focused in our work at NCAA on educating Native youth about the importance of Native vote, and I just wanted to mention that. We work with them, to make sure that they understand how to navigate the political process, the importance of doing so. Indian country's young. 42% of our population's under the age of 25. So we've partnered with Rock the Vote to reach these young voters, and also with the National Indian Education Association to develop curriculum that can be used by educators and in tribal schools. So I wanted to share those resources with you as well. Our presenters today here with me bring different organizational perspectives to this conversation. I'm excited for you to hear from them as well. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them now. First, to my far right is Kevin Killer. He's Oglala Lakota in Kiowa. He's served 10 years in the South Dakota legislature, representing District 27, which includes the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. He has extensive experience in youth leadership development, political and community organizing, and community development in tribal communities. He's the co-founder of Advanced Native Political Leaders. Thanks, Kevin. To my right, my immediate right, is Travis Lane, the Assistant Director for the Intertribal Council of Arizona. Travis is a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and he serves as the Assistant Director for the Intertribal Council, where he's coordinated voter outreach and education on behalf of the 21 member tribes of the Intertribal Council of Arizona since 2004. And to my left is Tammy Patrick. Tammy's formerly from the Bipartisan Policy Center, where she worked to promote the recommendations of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. She's also a former commissioner of the PCEA, was appointed by President Barack Obama in 2013. As a commissioner, Tammy was an active contributor to the work that led to a series of unanimous bipartisan recommendations on how to improve elections in the United States. She serves on the steering committee for National Voter Registration Day, as well as the board of advisors for the Center for Technology and Civic Life and the MIT Election Data Science Lab. Tammy's a senior advisor for the elections program at the Democracy Fund. Thank you all three for being with us. And Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Virginia. And I appreciate that introduction. And, it's, again, Alma Maka Ikilia Hime Chante Washte Nape Chuzapilo. And I just want to make sure you get that greeting in because that's how we traditionally greet our audiences, but also the online audience. My Lakota name is Close to Earth, and as the bio said, I'm currently serving the state legislature and making sure that we're represented there. And it's just a really honor to be here, especially with the panelists, but also in the Carter Center itself, and just with all of you, because I was thinking about and just listening to all the introductions and everything this morning, and just organizing in Pioneer Ridge in that area since 2004. I mean, not only OJ, but Brian Sells, Laughlin McDonald, they've played really instrumental parts in helping make sure that our community had representation with various lawsuits and just making sure that our voters' rights are protected. And it's really unique to be able to be the result of that product. And I was sharing with, I think it was Laughlin, that, in 2006, after the lawsuit took effect, we weren't in a position to be really organized. So, of course, there was, I think, two non-native, at least one non-native tribal member non-native tribal member that didn't serve our district. But in 2008, we actually had we were able to organize and stuff like that, and we had 3 tribal members, and thanks to the support of Four Directions and just that lawsuit itself, because, again, it's really unique to be a part of that. And as I mentioned earlier, as I'm transitioning out of this office, that districts has gone back and forth between representation and everything. But thankfully, we're able to get another tribal member in that seat to really make sure that we had that representation moving forward. And, there's going to be some really unique opportunities around redistricting. And hopefully I'll kind of allude to that. But one of the things I was thinking about this past election in 2018 and talking about the successes and just listening to everybody's presentation, it kind of seems like it's a bleak picture. But as Virginia was saying, that, our communities are extremely young, and, we need to get really smart about targeting certain populations, especially younger people and all that kind of stuff. And, I think one of the things that came out of this was a video that we were able to do with different people. And I won't, some of you may have seen it, some of you may have not. But just for the record, I just wanted to make sure that we got this out there. And it was in coordination with Native Americans in Philanthropy, the Native Voice Network, Chrissy Castro, myself, Sarah Eagleheart. And I'll kind of get into a little bit more of the details, but if you don't mind rolling the video right now. And it's kind of comedy, but I'll share more about that. So.
Hey, work. Auntie Beatrice here. Get me how good I look. I decided to vote. Yeah. And you know why? Because it matters. Just like it's important when you pick your snake, your man or your woman that you're gonna hook up with, who you hickey up and who you're gonna drop. Anyways, I came up with something new, you guys. Ask Auntie. Ask me anything, but don't ask me for money. Don't ask me how I got with your dad. Ask Auntie. Because I usually do all the talking because I'm the boss. Don't be acting shy either. Get over here and sit down. Be intimidated by me.
Auntie, isn't voting colonial? Isn't it like selling out?
excuse me while I educate this baby Joe. Oh, who are you calling a sellout? You know what? I should fight you. Like we have to fight for this right. Did you know that in 1948, natives couldn't even vote? So if you want to stick it to the man, you have to vote. Vote. Get out of here. This generation, you don't know nothing. My next guest, you guys, your new uncle. Yeah, Mark Buffalo. Oh, Uncle White Ruffalo. He played in Hoka. I mean, the Hulk.
How you been?
Good.
to see you again.
too.
Thank you for teaching us about the native ways on the res. The native people are so good at leading movements. You could help us get the young American vote out to vote in the midterms.
Auntie could do anything.
Yes.
I'm everybody's auntie. That means that you're everybody's uncle. We'll get your auntie something to drink.
Okay.
Mini Wachoni.
Mini Wachoni, I
Hurry
know
up.
what that means. Water is life.
Hurry up,
All
hurry
right,
up.
I'm going.
Up next, we have a young, handsome lad on the show.
Why should we even care about these elections? We're sovereign, right?
Cause what happens in these states affects sovereignty. You wanna stay sovereign? Well, vote. Now go. Let me see how to work this. Oh! Who are you? You weren't on the list?
I have a question for you, Auntie. I lost my driver's license. Can I still vote?
Well, yeah, you can use your tribal ID. Why don't you look in your wolf hat? Maybe it's there. Yeah. You can use that. Use that tribal ID to vote. There's no excuses.
That's it? Okay.
I don't really have a question, it's just more of a statement. I'm just not really that into politics.
Well, healthcare and Medicare, environmental issues, clean water, our SNAP, our EBT, powdered eggs. I love powdered eggs. Go tell them to vote. Yeah, like politics. I'm thirsty. Come on over, Grandpa. Come have a seat.
Hello.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question. Are you going to vote and why?
Yes, I'm going to vote. It's probably the most important election we will ever see. A lot of people have died, a lot of people have fought, a lot of people have been displaced, a lot of people have been put in cages because they failed to vote. It's now time for all of us to join together and walk forward and celebrate our nation instead of hiding from it.
Yes, good stuff, Grandpa.
Thank you.
We ask you to share that knowledge with everyone. All the elders, go. Go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grandpa, for all your knowledge.
Yeah.
You know what I was thinking? I was looking at your shirt, Stand with Standing Rock, and I thought of something. Stand and vote.
Stand and vote.
Yeah.
I love that. Stand and vote. No wonder you're everybody's auntie.
Go tell everyone to stand and vote.
Bye, auntie.
Your auntie still got it.
Hey, Auntie.
Jaylene Woodley, you're videoing me.
Mark told me about your new project. What can I do to be a better ally and help spread the word?
You can post about it. Stand and vote. Auntie has your back.
Cool. And, I think one of the cool things about that video is, it was really, the goal of that video was to make Native youth and eligible voters feel empowered and that their votes count. And the goal was to actually reach 3 million people. And then we got the statistics back from that. And thanks to Sarah Eaglehart, especially at Natives and Philanthropy, because she was the one that took the leadership around this. But the Stand and Vote hashtag reached at least 11.5 million people on Instagram and Twitter alone. The Stand and Vote video received at least 3 million views across platforms. The stand and vote content, including concert videos, supplementary memes, graphics, live stream, GIFs, received at least 1.03 million video views and over 1.1 million likes. The anti-Beatrice GOT live stream on Election Day generated 33,000 views at a critical moment for voter engagement. Targeted Facebook ads generated over 150,000 views in critical targeted states, and that included North Dakota, Arizona, Montana, and I can't remember, I think Washington. And it and there was yielding over 16,500 clicks. AJ Plus and Mike.com both created repackaged stand and vote videos. And some of the major influences that shared this was, you saw Mark Ruffalo, but Shailene Woodley, the Dave Matthews Band, Tanya Jo Hall, who was anti-Beatrice, Billy Ray Cyrus, Taboo, Alicia Keys, America Ferrera, Piper Perabo, and Leonardo DiCaprio all shared this video. And so that's kind of the breakdown of some of that stuff that happened that day. And it's just, like I said, I mean, being in the state legislature, I think one of the things that, you have to be a certain policy wonk to really, really appreciate policy. But for the average person, when I talk to them about why did I vote on this, it takes me 10 minutes to get to the point on why I voted on something. And by that time, they're pretty bored, But the video itself was like 5 minutes, and it delivered a really good point. And I think that's one of the things that with working with some of the influencers in the video, there's just a really unique opportunity to kind of capitalize on this initiative, especially for getting people who have influence aware of our Native issues, around this issue. And I think one of the things that came up that was unique is I was a part of a state legislators group. It's called the Quad Caucus, and it's actually funded by, I think, Kellogg and NEEKC, and there's a couple other foundations. But one of the tasks that they gave us, and it's legislators, it's legislative leadership, state leadership of African American, Latino, Asian American, and Native. And there's 10 of us from every caucus that are state legislators, and they asked us to come up with a video around the census, because we started getting all the census data, all this kind of stuff about what's the next thing coming up. And in our group, we actually asked for an influencer, and we thought about the Avengers because it's going to be a big thing, but it's just really important to capitalize on that. So we got one Avenger, how do we get another Avenger to really talk about our issues and all that kind of stuff, because it's just, it's an important time for that, So that's kind of, I guess, what I have for now, and I'll kind of elaborate a little bit more on some other things that come up through the panel. But yeah, so thank you for sitting there, sharing the video, and I'll talk some more. Thanks. Yeah, it's on YouTube, and I'll make sure that the link gets out to everybody. So.
Well, good afternoon. I do have a PowerPoint. I was just going to give an overview of the Native Vote in Arizona project that we did through the Intertribal Council of Arizona. This is a map of the tribes in Arizona. There are 22 federally recognized tribes. We're pretty diverse tribes. We have a tribe, the Havasupai tribe, located at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. We have a tribe as a village called Old Oribe. It's the longest continuously living inhabited village in North America, although tribes in New Mexico might disagree with that. We have the largest land-based, 5 of the largest land-based tribes in Arizona: Navajo, White Mountain, San Carlos, Gila River, and Thanatom. And we work with all 21 member tribes when it comes to the Native Vote effort. 22 tribes, excuse me. We're just like NCAI, we were established as a result of the Termination Era that was going on in the 40s and the 50s. And sort of the idea of creating intertribal was really initiated with a meeting with the governor back in 1952. We were one of the first regional intertribal associations created in the United States, but there were a lot of intertribals created around that time because of the Termination Era. And we all came together because we wanted to have that united voice like Virginia was talking about. Yeah, and our mission is to take matters on behalf of our member tribes collectively and individually to promote tribal sovereignty and strengthen tribal governance. In 1975, we created a nonprofit organization. There were some federal benefits that were going to the state of Arizona that were not going to the tribes, and so we created a nonprofit organization to serve as an intermediary so that we could accept those funds and administer those programs on behalf of our member tribes. And that's what we do today. We accept a lot of federal money and we administer different programs on their behalf. I'd like to acknowledge the National Congress for American Indians, and ITCA has been a long time participant of the Native Vote campaign. NCAI has hosted trainings in Arizona, and we've been able to utilize many of their resources throughout the years. And ITCA has been doing voter engagement since we started the nonprofit in 1975. This is one of our first Native American voter guides that we created back in 1976. And when we were doing this voter work back in the early 80s, we realized that no one knew who Frank Harrison or Harry Austin were. No one knew who Peter Porter was or Rudolph Johnson were. And these were the leaders back in the 40s and the 50s that allowed the ability for the native right to vote to occur in Arizona. And this marked with the 1948 ruling that allows the native vote and the right to vote in Arizona is the 70th anniversary of this year. So we're very proud of that. We did do a short video back in the 80s that provides a history of Indian voting rights in Arizona. It is available on YouTube. You can just put a search for that and you can find it. It's about 14 minutes. And so for this election, 2018 election, these are the 4 things that we focused on as far as our Native Vote project: voter registration, voter education, GOTV efforts, and election protection. Just some data. This information comes from One Arizona. They're the state table that manages the Voter Activation Network, or the VAN. This data isn't perfect. So what they do is they use zip code and surname to identify Native voters. My name is Travis Lane, and I live in Tempe, Arizona. It's not in the tribe, so I'm not included in this data. So there's a lot of people like me, maybe in the urban areas, that are not included. But generally, we have about, I think, a 45% registered voters. And this is just a bar graph demonstrating what that looks like in the 2014 and 2016 elections. So in general, I do think it's safe to say we have very low voter registration numbers among American Indians, and also very low voter turnout. And that was really the basis of why we wanted to really increase our efforts for this 2018 election. So for voter registration, we were very fortunate to get some funds to actually hire Native vote specialists. Since 2004, it's primarily just been me doing this work as much as I can as sort of other duties as a side, but we actually got some real meaningful resources, and so we hired a Native vote specialist. His name is Alex, and he hit the ground running. He went to powwows, movie nights, community events, parent nights, community colleges, IHS, everywhere where we tried to get an opportunity to engage American Indians. In that short level of effort between when we got the funds to hire Alex to the voter registration deadline, we were, successful in getting about 230 voter registrations. But I think we can definitely do more if we are able to secure additional funds. For voter education, we did do a voter guide for this year. We wanted to do a mass mailing, send it to every person we had a mailing address for. The partner that we worked with who provides the mailing addresses normally works with urban coalitions, and so when they gave us their mailing address list, they gave us the physical address list, not the P.O. box. And so it really limited the amount of mailings that we could have done. So we just mainly focused in Flagstaff, and so we do need to begin to educate some of our partners around the native and rural nature of our communities. As far as our GOTV efforts, we did some phone banking. We made 25,000 calls, text messaging. Actually, that text messaging is 28,000. We did some 22 posts on Facebook. We actually produced 3 videos, and of those 3 videos, we produced 3 ads. And I wanted to show an ad that we produced. We actually were able to film on Hopi to do this ad, and it went out to all of the Facebook target audience with zip codes and locations and things like that. So can you show the video?
The non-tribal elections is coming soon. If you are unable to make it to your polling location on November 6th, request for an absentee ballot and have a say in our future. Thank you.
So a big conversation that we had with our Native Vote Coalition was that we see a lot of Native Americans may live in Phoenix Monday through Friday, but then go back to White River on the weekends, or they have a house in Thanawatam, but they work full-time in Phoenix. And so we wanted to make sure that wherever they were at, that they needed to request an absentee ballot, and we really pushed out that ad. In general, yeah, we got over 410,000 views on our ads. And the one thing that we didn't talk about, or we didn't include in our Native GOTV efforts was canvassing. In years past, different voting groups have tried to do that in tribal communities. There's some real challenges. One is you need a four-wheel truck to get across any tribal community because there's no roads. You're doing it during the fall season, so it's going to be snowy, so the roads are going to be really bad. And then on top of that, we have a real roaming dog population issue in Arizona, the res dogs. But it's become more of a real public health threat lately because we do have the presence of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It's a disease that's on the brown dog tick that lives on the dog. And so it's killed about 30 people, mostly children, because the kids are the ones that play with the dogs. So we did not want our volunteers to go out canvassing because of the threat of them getting sick. And of course, some of the dogs could be rabid. That lesson wasn't necessarily taken by the Democratic Party, and they were doing some canvassing up at Navajo, and they did have 2 volunteers get bit. So that's something that we need to think about how we can solve that problem. And then for election protection, we work with ASU's Indian Legal Clinic. We do a 3-tiered election protection plan. We have a hotline. We have volunteers at polling locations, and we have roaming lawyers to be available should there be any legal intervention needed. We received about 180 phone calls. A lot of them were about checking their registration status, but across Arizona, machines were breaking down. Things can't be printed. They were being told to go to different polling locations where if it was out of precinct voting, they wouldn't be able to get to cast their vote casted. And then there are also real problems with ID and having them be actually in the voter registration database when they swear they voted 2 years ago, that they knew that they voted here at this entire place, and then we were able to use the van to make sure that that was the case and that they were able to cast a ballot. And there's a whole host of other issues that I didn't include in here, but Patty does a really great job doing a report at the end of each election to let us know what's going on. And this is just a picture at Guadalupe of a sheriff parked in front of a polling location, something that seems to occur every election, it seems like, Patty. So we continue to have to work with some problems with law enforcement intervening in our elections. So as far as next steps, we've had a long conversation about the relationship between tribes and counties, and so we do plan to have a forum in February to talk about some of these issues. We'll report out the results, report out our election protection project, and then we'll have this conversation about how can we ensure equal access for our American Indians in Arizona living on tribal lands. We'll also have a Native Vote strategy session in May to plan for the 2020 election. We want to work with our tribes to do a tribal enrollment bump with their van so we can actually have really good, accurate data as far as who's registered and who's not. And we want to then focus on voter registration because we continue to have low numbers. And also, whenever you do voter registration in Arizona and you ask the people that have registered to vote, they say, I can't register because I'm a felon. So we want to make sure we do some voter restoration stuff as well. And then finally, just wanted to thank our funders and also our supporters. There's so many people that supported this effort this past year that I didn't include it, but I did want to at least acknowledge those that were very instrumental in our project. And that's a picture of our staff with their Native Vote t-shirts. So thank you.
I also have a presentation, so while I'm waiting for it to come up, it's wonderful to be here, to see so many near and dear friends. I was asked to give a little bit of a reflection on my time as an election official in Arizona, and then also a little bit of an overview of what I've been seeing around the country in the last few years since I left Arizona. What I'm hopeful is that I'll give you some actionable tasks, and maybe if I'm really lucky, actually inspire some action. I want to speak almost directly to election administrators, those who are viewing this online, and also those in the room, and with the caveat that I'm going to perhaps cover some weedy election administration topics, but it's all because they tie directly into the voter's experience, because I think that's really what we need to focus in on. When I was asked to come here today, I gave pause because it was over a decade ago, Travis, oh my God, that we had the Native American Voter Outreach Summit, which I organized in Arizona. And it was a great couple of days where we talked about many of the issues that we're discussing here today. What gives me pause is that we're still covering many of the same challenges and issues when it comes to how do we reach rural and remote voters? How do we cover those great distances? How do we identify urban voters within our urban centers? How do we provide effective language assistance and ensure that our translations are in fact accurate? The complexity of providing language assistance in unwritten languages or languages that are mostly oral can be very, very daunting, and also how to ensure that the materials are accurate and usable for the end user. I also always think it's interesting when I look back at my time in Arizona, because you'll notice the underline of board workers, because that's what they call poll workers there, and I still find myself saying that occasionally, and it always underlines it still after all these years. So a couple of years after we had the Native American Voter Outreach Summit, I did serve on President Obama's PCEA, and one of my proudest moments actually was making sure that we heard about some of the challenges faced in Indian country around both the lower 48, but then also we had a meeting, and I thank Natalie and everyone up in Anchorage for helping us to convene individuals to speak to the commissioners. Most of them, with the exception of Ben Ginsberg, who had worked in Alaska, had never heard of some of these challenges and were unaware about the issues when bilingual workers were not hired, materials were not being translated, the poor quality of translation, the fact that in Alaska there are many polling places where you can only get to it by an airplane, or if the rivers are frozen, by snowmobile, and how oftentimes now those rivers are no longer freezing. So we came up with our American Voting Experience report, and it calls for the enforcement of the federal statutes we already have, like the Voting Rights Act, offers some resources and some solutions. But what I wanted to talk to today are these four things: recognition, inclusivity, collaboration, and commitment. Recognition, I think the very first thing for myself when I was working in Arizona is to recognize the history of discrimination and the past relationships that may not have been productive. And you can go into a situation with the purest of hearts and still face the obstacles of our past. And that can be very daunting, particularly in Arizona, where, as has been mentioned, the first barrier can be that past to overcome, because in Arizona, Native Americans did not get the right to vote until 1948. This slide is a slide I used in our poll worker or board worker training classes, because I think it's important for people to understand the context with which they are encountering voters and serving those voters. Also, talking to elders who remember that history can be very daunting, and trying to explain to them why they should listen to me, why one more person coming into the Agency on Aging is someone that they should take to heart. And what I found is that voting is personal for everyone. And so explaining, you know what, there's a school board election coming up. There's a school bond issue that's going to be voted on, and your children go to the school, your grandchildren go to the school, your family serves in the military. Making that a personal connection was often really what did it. And there's nothing more gratifying than registering someone to vote for the first time. It's great when they just turn 18. It's even more compelling when they're 88. It's also important to identify what current barriers we have for voters. And Patty, if I'm not mistaken, you took this picture, and I have used it a lot. So my apologies and gratitude go to you. So identify current barriers for voters. If your state has a voter ID law, does it contemplate tribal ID? Does it cover it in poll worker training or board worker training? Rural addressing is something that we've been talking about a lot today, and it can be an issue both for registration, for finding polling places, including voting by mail. So what are the solutions that we can find across the board, whether that's utilizing some sort of common data format for voter registration information, which in fact the National Institute of Standards and Technology is publishing that within the next month. Is that going to be widely adapted? I certainly hope so. Will it take time? Absolutely. But if across the board people start using the same types of formats with a number and a name and a direction, that in and of itself will greatly improve what information we're working off of. Also, the utilization of GIS, we heard about ARC services, ArcGIS earlier today, is helpful in making sure our voters are placed where they can appropriately get the right ballot. We talked a lot also this morning, for those of you joining us online, about mail ballot delivery as well as other materials. It's important to know your voting population and whether or not they receive home delivery, if they have to frequent a post office box, or if in fact there are cluster boxes available. One of my more remote villages that I had the privilege of visiting every election was the Kaka village down on the Atam reservation. And when I first started going down there, everyone had to drive all the way to Ajo to get their mail. And it was quite a drive. It was about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. A couple of years before I left Arizona, the Postal Service had put in cluster boxes right there in the village, so people could just walk to get their mail. And that's the sort of thing that I think we can think of in terms of solutions. It's also important to know the preferred voting method of your voters. This is Nora. She worked in our voter registration department in Maricopa County, and before she came to work for the county, she had not registered to vote, nor had she ever voted. She preferred to vote early, in person. And what I'd like to do now is share with you one of my favorite materials from Charles Stewart, who's a professor of political science at MIT. And he has this chart that shows you how people are choosing to vote when given options. This chart's okay, but my favorite is what I'm going to scroll through here. I like to liken this to an election snow globe. So in 1996, election day is at the top. Vote by mail is down on one corner of the triangle, and voting in person early is at the other. And when given the option, more and more voters tend to go away from Tuesday's voting. So I like to go through that one a couple of times because I think it's fascinating. Voters get options, voters migrate down to what serves them best, with the exception, of course, of all of those at the top that still really only have Tuesday as their election day. Why I think this is important is that for states that are there in the middle, they have a third of their population are voting early, in person, a third by mail, a third on Tuesday. So knowing how people like to vote, you'll notice that even for states like Washington, Oregon, Colorado, they still have some individuals who prefer to go and vote in person or who have to just by virtue of their voter record or their registration. This is where it becomes really important to know your data. Now, this data is from 2012. It's provisional voters. These were ones that were counted. And what I would always do was, it was important to me to know whether or not there are policies that were affecting certain populations differently. So this is a percentage of provisional ballots voted by Hispanic surname voters, which we kept track of in order to allocate our bilingual poll workers, non-Hispanic surname voters, and then Native American voters living on the reservation. So the Hispanic surname voters had the Native American precincts removed because there was some overlap there with some of the surnames. In an ideal situation, the lines are straight across, where across the electorate, voters are voting their percentages of these types of provisionals in all the same way. But you can see that some of the lines are not straight across. Interestingly enough, the red line on the top has to do with voters not returning their early ballot and going to the polls and having to vote a provisional. We found that Native American voters were actually 15% less likely to have to vote a provisional ballot for that reason as the main reason for voting. We also knew that ID addresses was more of an issue for Native American voters. This second chart, however, is more problematic because these are ones that did not count. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that on the axis, the numbers have changed. So we're now 0 to 16%. There's a dramatic difference in voters who were not registered, the purple line. That was one of the largest reasons why our Native American voters were not having their ballots count. Not having an ID was equally proportionate across all types of electors. So it's things like that that I think knowing your data and knowing it's one thing to get a voter registered, it's another thing to have them turn out, but ideally what we really want is for their ballot to count. That's where we get to inclusivity. In an elections department, it should really reflect the voters and the people that it serves, both at the polls and in the office. One of the very effective programs we had in Arizona and others have as well as youth engagement. I was just recently in Alaska, and there's a very robust grouping of young individuals, and they call themselves the language warriors, and they are a force to reckon with. Because really the presence of the language is in and of itself a welcoming sign that this is your process, this is your democracy. And one of the things that I think we always need to do is consider the impact on our elders and utilizing their knowledge, their expertise in a way to ensure that the quality of the process that we are providing to the voters is in fact aligned with their information and their history of how the language should be used, what are the proper protocols. So implementing focus groups, advisory groups, having them be part of the translation, quality control. Everyone has a story about translations that have gone horribly awry. So it's always good to engage to make sure that leadership and tribal elders agree with the translations that are being shared publicly. Collaboration. I think a very important thing for election administrators is that we need to be willing to set aside preconceived notions of what we want from the other person or the other individuals, what can be done, and truly what we consider as a success. Because what we need to do is build consensus. Partnerships matter. So it's really critical that we be where the voters are. Now this picture, I have to say, is down at the Ira B. Hayes Memorial, and there were a lot of people there that day. You see all the empty chairs. It was about 118. So we were where the voters were, and that was in the shade. It was Arizona after all. But this is a great place to be able to make sure that you're in the community at the times when people are thinking about civic engagement and want to hear about the process and what's necessary. There are other resources available. Democracy Fund, where I currently work, has another arm, Democracy Fund Voice, and we partner with the Election Assistance Commission in the past 3 years. And all of the materials, presentations, best practices are available out on the webs, as they say. And then lastly, commitment. Be in it for the long term. This is not, I'm going to schedule Tuesday to go into the tribal office and say hi and tell them what I want from them and what we're going to do, and then I'll be out of there in an hour and back in the city. It's a long-term commitment. It's building relationships, and it's understanding that this is, in fact, not only for our generation, but the next generation and the generation after that. Positive change can happen. Alaska hosted their first statewide language summit this year. It was an amazing couple of days up in Anchorage. And even though there are sometimes what are seemingly insurmountable obstacles to overcome, people of goodwill can come together and really do great things for our voters. They now have a far more vibrant program than they had when we had our meeting there of the PCEA just a couple of years ago. So recognition, inclusivity, collaboration, and commitment. When I was asked to reflect on this, I really was thinking about perspectives and some of the rewards. And over the last 15 years or so, as I've done this work, there are communications and conversations that resonate. And one of them happens to be with the gentleman sitting here at the table with me. And there was a time a few years ago when I called up Travis and we were chatting. He said, "So how's everything going?" And I said, "I'm just trying to keep my head above water." And he said, "Oh, you're just floating along." And I stopped and I thought, that is not what I meant at all. I'm frantically treading water. And then I thought, but I don't have to. In some of my most frantic moments, Travis, I think about what you said, and I think maybe I just need to lay back and look at the sky and see where the current takes me. I need to not fight the current. I need to be appreciative of where this water is flowing and what sights I might see along the way. So I want to thank you all again, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you all so much. We're going to open it up for questions now, either here in the room or online. Questions for any of our panelists? Observations, other things you'd like to add to the conversation? Stimulate anybody's thinking about best practices? Go ahead, Patty.
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Killer with regards to your social media presence and how long it took to plan that and the amount of effort that went into it and how y'all were able to engage I guess you had different celebrities, which I assume came out of relationships from the No Dapple, and then you kind of use that to springboard into the voting. But if you could share, I think that'd be very helpful.
Cool. Thank you for the question. And yeah, I think one of the biggest things was from that whole process was that Sarah Eagleheart was a major factor in this, and she's with Natives in Philanthropy, but I think one of her goals was and we talked about it after the last election in 2016, because I think one of the unique things that we had with the previous administration was unprecedented access for Native issues, Indigenous issues around different subjects. And, we were able to place different people on different commissions and different boards and all that, as, you've seen on the panel. But as the politics kind of changed, I think that's one thing that a lot of our communities, we tend to react and not plan, And so we talked about that and saying that, okay, well, what's going to be next for a lot of our communities, and who and who's going to carry that message for us, because we are losing a lot of key U.S. senators, and we're also losing like that voice at that level, outside of tribal leadership and some Congress people and all that, but it was getting a lot more thing. And it was right around the time of Standing Rock, and I think that's one thing that we were able to kind of look at and tap into and say that, well, how can we use this unique celebrity influencer voice? At the same time, we had, the rise of Instagram and the rise of just different platforms where, like the Standing Rock Youth Council could go out and, cause a worldwide movement. Just a group of Native youth going to run, but also, it caught the attention of Shailene Woodley, who, of course, has so many influencers, and just being really strategic and smart about how to, they still wanted to do stuff after Standing Rock. And so then there was different celebrity groups coming up too with the same premise. And they were like, okay, how can we coordinate the Native voice into this issue? Because I think there's a certain awareness now of trying to be more intentional about including Indigenous, Native influence and recognition and acknowledgement. You see that a lot more in presentations where people actually acknowledge the land that we're on. And I think we were up on the panel talking about whose land are we on, actually. And I said Cherokee, but I think it was Creek, right? Creek was one of the ones. Cherokee's more further north. But just being aware of that, at all places at all times, getting people to recognize that and talk about that. And so the video itself actually came together through one of these influencer groups, and It was America Ferrera's group, but I think the person that worked with Mark Ruffalo happened to be at this meeting in New York, and she was just kind of like, how can we do more? Because she was at Standing Rock, and she really wanted to kind of, keep that going and stuff like that. And so, that was in April, and then we actually got together in, I want to say September or August, actually. We got together in August of this past year, and then we were able to kind of raise the funds. And I think the actual thing itself cost maybe around $20,000. So it wasn't that much, but it was just making sure that we had that voice in there. And the other unique thing I think about doing this work, and to be able to capture that unique voice in all of this, is that we were really intentional about making sure that we had not only the idea, because Chrissy Castro, Sarah, and myself, and Julia, we all came up with the idea in Hollywood. So of course, in Hollywood, you sit around dinner and you come up with the idea, then boom, it comes a movie. So but part of it was making sure that we had native writers. Native writers to be able to kind of tell that native humor. And that's one of the unique things about the thing is that, I think working on campaigns too, and OJ can attest to this, and anybody who's worked on campaigns, is that, they always use Native communities and Native people for the grunt work, but they never put or elevate us into these positions of leadership. So we almost had to take it over, and start doing our own thing to make sure that we have our own voice and valid and people recognize our work. And I think that was really intentional. So, and the group that we got, they're the ones that had access to Mr. Ruffalo, but we were really intentional about finding a Native director, and like in the room, we're all campaign organizers, and when they say how many Native campaign organizers can work on a presidential campaign, well, I would challenge the room to name how many Native directors are there, and that can actually make a commercial. So it gets lesser and lesser, and luckily we had Rizal Benally, who actually was going to school, graduate school at NYU, and she does amazing work in Sundance and all that kind of stuff, but she was really aware of a lot of the issues. So when you have a Native writer, Native producers, Native director, and then we had Native talent, we were able to kind of really influence that process, and making sure that we told authentic story, but also being able to have that historical knowledge of 1948, Kamad eggs, all that kind of, there was things that got cut out. That was really funny. But because of, 501c4 stuff and C3 stuff, we had to be really careful about that, So, but it was just a unique process that we're hoping to kind of model and take forward for 2020. And just trying to figure out how, what is next, and what is the interest and who wants to support this kind of stuff, because it does take time. And that's the other thing too, is that, I know everybody in the room has done work in Native communities and understands the funding dynamics, but for the funders and for the online audience, one of the biggest frustrations being a Native elected or working on Native campaigns, and even in this case, is that the money always comes in really late, so you can't be effective. And I think I liken that to being, as a part of a war. Like if you're going to get resources at the end of your battle, you're not going to be as effective to be able to plan out the whole thing, because that's really what we're kind of out here kind of strategizing for and fighting for, is making sure that we have those rights. And people are going to organize money against us that's well planned and well used. And I think that's the biggest thing is just making sure that resources come in early, so we can really adequately plan out what we want to do, and working with some of the groups in the room. So.
Go ahead, OJ.
Well, first of all, that was an actual true story about Auntie. I mean, if you go to Indian country, you're going to find Auntie there, and she's going to talk to you just that way. Don't think it's different. One of the things that Kevin said that is really true, and if you look around this table, is we've actually separated ourselves from political parties. And we found that what we need to do, if we want to do it, we have to do it as Native Americans on our own or in a coalition. The voter ID that came up in North Dakota, where they wanted physical addresses, I keep on saying it was a farce because they had Native American families that lived about a quarter mile away. They had their physical address in the liquor store. And that's what they had for where they're supposed to vote from. And once they found out, they were afraid to vote, because then knowing that that wasn't really their address, they'd actually be committing voter fraud. So we had problems with how they were trying to do this voter ID. But one of the things we came up with, we called it our fail-safe temporary voter ID physical address map. And we reached out to Claremont Graduate University, and of the 4 reservations, we were able to map out physical addresses for every native there within that community. And we did it kind of like in a city where you have a skyscraper, and you have one address here, but you have Suite A, Suite B, 102. So what we did is we picked out like 1 or 2 locations within the precinct, and we made that their address. And as a voter showed up, that voter became 415 South Avenue West 1. And if they came in the second, they were 413 South Avenue 2. And one of the things that really shook up the North Dakota state legislatures and the election officials was the way that we worked with Claremont to do this. Is all they needed then was a tribal ID that consisted of the tribe's letterhead with a name, a date of birth, and a physical address. And what they forgot was a picture. And so we were able to take and have individuals vote using the tribal ID letterhead without a actual photo ID, which made it actually, once we started thinking about it, a lot easier than paying $15 or $20 for a state ID, when all we had to do now was give them a physical address and pay them like 20 cents for the copy of the tribal letterhead. So, but again, that's things that we come up with that, it's really gets down to it. It's never really a party issue. For Arizona, for example, Navajo Nation, the parties didn't want anything. They were mad at us that we filed a lawsuit because we were looking out for the interests of our tribal members. And the Attorney General there is very straightforward in saying this is what we want. Patty got to meet a Trump judge. She was very excited. But I guess I just want to follow up on what Kevin's saying is more and more we find ourselves, if we want to actually do something, we have to look amongst ourselves for the answer. What I like about here in Carter Center is we're able to tell you our stories. And hopefully we're able to learn some of the things you learned so we can use it against you. No, I don't mean it that way. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question. I don't know if my question's to Kevin or maybe to all of you, but Kevin was talking about even in the making of a film, right? The importance of Native talent, Native directors, Native people, Native writers, Native people at all levels. And I think that's something that we were talking about here earlier, right? That we need Native people to be able to tell you, the state election administration officials, what their communities need. And I was curious, I've been thinking about, my wheels have been turning today, kind of thinking about various, kind of structural mechanisms to make sure that input is happening on a regular basis. And I just wondered if folks around the room have any examples of that, where they think that whether it's the tribal governments or tribal stakeholders are involved in a helpful way. I mean, you talked about the one employee in the voter registration office. I don't know if there are states with tribal liaisons that are working well, or advisory councils, or other kind of structural mechanisms that folks would identify as a best practice.
I would say that for myself, when I was in Maricopa, it was incredibly helpful to have Intertribal Council and Travis right there. So any states where there is that immediate capacity to be able to get the information out to all of the member tribes. Travis and the former director were always very, very helpful in inviting me in to share information when there was changing in legislation, what new practices were going to be. So I think that if in fact there are other entities that people can identify within their own states to serve as a conduit, that would be incredibly helpful.
Travis, this for you. You know, you're talking about the van, and in some cases we do work with individuals that have a van, and what they've asked us to do is to give the names of the Native Americans we identified through surveys, our voter registration, and in this case we were working with the Navajo Nation, and one of the things that we told them, and it, you know, could hurt us in the long run or not hurt us, but we would not supply that information unless they actually got a RIB from the nation saying that we could release those names. Have you guys discussed anything like that, or?
Yeah, for the Native Vote Strategy session that we'll be planning in May, we want to bring in, and I think, did you find the tribe who did it?
No, but I confirmed there are tribes.
Okay, there are tribes out there that have bumped their tribal enrollment with the van, and we want to do that in Arizona. There's 2 tribes already that are interested in it, but we really haven't gone through the legalities or the details of what that's going to look like. But we hope that through that process, we can have more accurate data, have more targeted. We could target people who are not registered. We could target people around GOTV. And I think that will, and hopefully with the tribal enrollment bump, then we can target people on and off the reservation as well. Navajo isn't a member of our organization. We would encourage them to do it, but that would be something that we'd be happy to help facilitate if Navajo is interested in that. I know the IRB process for Navajo can be fun. But I would be committed to doing that with any of the tribes that are interested in Arizona.
Again, just one, and I promise I won't ask any more.
I said earlier today, why is OJ not on this panel? I was right.
One of the things, and I'm glad you brought up the tribal voters list, because what we did, like on our reservation, Rosebud, we have our own tribal voters list that has every member in every community. And what we did is we took the tribal voters list and we compared it with the state voters list. And like in Antelope, we had like 2,200 people in Antelope. And we found out only 900 of them were registered in the state. And we had very little time. So what we did is we took the tribal names, we opened a Facebook account, and we started putting in the tribal names. We already knew the communities, we already had their names, and we started shooting friend requests on Facebook. And what that allowed us to do is, even if they didn't accept it, we could message it, send them through Messenger. So that might be, something that you might think about. We did that in Nevada, and what turned out was their tribal list. We were able not only to use it, within the Pyramid Lake and Walker River, but we then started to be able to identify people in Reno. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that is another thing that we need to start looking at as far as if we're going to increase something.
I just thinking about these videos and what Travis presented with regards to the challenges of getting people to vote, and then they vote, and then they learn that they're not registered, and then Tammy presenting that there's a high rate of people who aren't registered. And I think it would be interesting, based on the study that the coalition did, that a lot of people don't trust the government, don't know why they should be participating in elections. And I think it's the same thing with regards to participating in the census, which is going to impact redistricting and ultimately the vote. And I think it might be helpful, and I think other people have been thinking about this because we know that the census isn't going to be well funded with regards to outreach to tribal communities. And I know there are conversations going on at a higher level than but I mean, how do we look at all of these things and have this outreach to try to get people to participate? I mean, I think the anti-video was pretty good. And, you know, and then Tammy, you had that list. This is why you need to vote. And are there I guess, ways that aren't so expensive and ways to use social media that we could start working on that, because 2020 is around the corner and that will be an election and also the census. I hope you can solve that problem. Your panel.
Well, when the videos that we did were very low cost. What we wanted to invest in was the ads, and those were particularly expensive. I think in total to do, so OJ, to your suggestion, that's kind of what we did. We took the Native Vote universe and we matched it with the Facebook, how we matched it with the Facebook. So I never saw those ads because I'm not in the Native Vote universe, but a lot of it was American Indian. The list that we got, we matched it with the Facebook ads, and that's how the ads were rolling. And that cost, for I think a 14-day run, it cost around $17,000 to do that. But that, the result was that we had 410,000 views of all the videos that we showed. That was resources that, by some miracle, we were able to obtain through All Voting is Local. The gentleman with that organization was really interested in wanting to push out the Native Vote, and so he put forth those resources to do it. So very low on the production, but high on the ads.
And I think Travis brings up a good point about the low production value of filming in Native communities. It's really good because I think about with the upcoming census and being able to think beyond just the Native community itself, but and going back to that conversation we had with all the other legislators from other communities of color, because the census is going to affect every single one of those communities differently. But whether we participate or don't participate, and if we can get the legislative leadership at those levels, especially state levels are so easy to access your leadership. And being able to kind of say, okay, well, how do we make an Avengers video about the census, and because it's targeting that millennial generation, I think because you think about when Avengers comes out in April, there's going to be a lot of interest around it, but it's going to pique the interest of a lot of millennials and millennials of color and stuff like that. And I know they did Wakanda the Vote, that around Black Panther. We did, the anti-Beatrice video. And it's just trying to figure out what is unique to a lot of our communities and being able to really, make that message. And that's something that I'm going to commit to work on with, hopefully Natives in Philanthropy and our group with advanced Native political leaders, and just making sure that we kind of get that understanding out there that the census is going to affect us all in different ways, just like the Thanos snap, you know what I mean? Like everybody disappeared, half of the population disappeared at the end of that film, and that's basically what's going to happen if we don't participate in the census, and there's a really strong message around that, and so just sitting up here and thinking through it, I mean, there's ideas coming up right now, so yeah.
That's because I guess maybe Atlanta is better than Hollywood for good ideas. I think that, and I didn't really say that. So I think that this is all amazing content, and one of the things that I found with all of the good social media that's out there, there's also the bad social media, and just making sure that we're monitoring, in addition to having great messages, the monitoring of misinformation and disinformation that's out there. And I do think that being there in person. So when I was in Arizona, we went to as many of the Agency on Aging meetings as we possibly could. And that's a great venue to be showing videos as well, to reach people who maybe don't have smart devices. Another thing that we did periodically, every couple of months or so, as I would go down, and the district would bring in every day for lunch, they would bring in the elders, and we would go down and talk about what was going to be happening in the elections, when deadlines were coming up. And also there was just a recent study that was published by Democracy Fund on Native American media outlets, and I think that might be something to look at as well. So as the newsrooms around the country have kind of had the impact of the last couple of years, so too have Native American newsrooms and media sources. So looking at how do we bolster those voices as both a conduit for voter information, but as well as just a way of keeping communities together.
I just wanted to jump in real quick just for a couple of things on census. One thing it just dawned on me a lot of people may not be aware of. We actually know the very first place in the country that's going to be enumerated by the Census Bureau. It's going to be one of our clients. Hooper Bay in Alaska will be the very first place in the United States to be enumerated. I believe the date they set is January 15th, 2020. The Census Bureau is actually going to start in Alaska 3 months earlier than the rest of the country, largely because of the accessibility issues. But one of the other things that I think also needs to be brought out, and it just kind of reiterates a lot of the points about trying to maximize low expense solutions, is there's been a lot of discussion that the Census Bureau is not funded sufficiently. It's not true. The Census Bureau has plenty of funding for the 2020 census, at least as what has been appropriated through fiscal year 2019. The problem is the Census Bureau has been doing slow hiring. They've got fewer than 200 program specialists. They're expecting to have somewhere between 1,500 and 1,750. And the reason why they're doing it is because they're trying to slow hire and slow down the process, because they're concerned that they may not get everything they want for fiscal year 2020 appropriations. And so they're literally taking money that's already been appropriated. They should be getting people in place and people working toward working with Indian country now. And they're delaying that. They're going to start their hiring much more in earnest starting in February and March of next year, actually bringing the people on board. And part of what it highlights is the thing that we've really been hammering census on for a long time, which is that, okay, we get that you're going to make us engage in far more self-help on this than we should, that we're going to, private organizations and tribes are going to have to pick up a lot more of the slack than they've had to pick up in the past. At least give us your outreach and publicity program, your information. Give all that information as early as possible, because we need it. If you're not going to provide, the other issue, we talked about language assistance. This is really bad news for everyone in the room probably. The only Native American language that there will be any census coverage for at all is going to be Navajo. It's going to be much more limited. There are only 12 languages that will be covered in their entirety. Navajo will get some written publicity materials, but that's all. Every other Alaska Native and American Indian language, including the places that are covered by Section 203, there will be no specific outreach and publicity done by the Census Bureau in those languages. And so what that really means is that, everyone in this group that works with Native Americans, including the state groups that are working on the Census 2020, need to work on identifying where they have issues in terms of language accessibility. Part of the census counts for your state has to focus on bringing in people who are going to be part of bilingual translation panels to start working on that translation now, because it's simply not going to be done. It's unfortunate. The decision's already been made. The advisory committee's made recommendations on 3 separate meetings saying, please give us more language assistance. It's just simply not going to happen.
I just wanted to follow up on OJ's statement a few minutes ago. I think it's really valuable if we could study those that are voting in the tribal elections versus and the gap between that and those are registered for the state elections. And I thought the video was awesome, and that's going to reach some of those people. But I think having a better understanding of why there's that gap. And, whatever reasons, no judgment for that, but just to identify it, to see, okay, what are the different things that we can be doing? What might we be able to do to reach some of these people? Because I can guarantee you it's not one answer why there's a gap there. And so, doing some research, whether it's academics or just, within the communities, to figure out why are some people registered and fully participating in tribal elections but not in the other elections, and then that can help us to have an understanding if we need to do something different or do something more, or if it doesn't matter.
I think that's a great suggestion. Is anybody aware of any work that's already been done in that regard? Looking around. Yeah. I mean, I know, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, we all talked a lot about, a good strategy being kind of co-locating tribal and state and federal elections. And then, in more recent years, I've heard some, concerns about that approach. And my guess is that works well in some places and hasn't worked so well in others. But it's a really interesting question. I think you're right. What's going on with the folks that participate in their tribal elections, but not state and federal? Are there any other questions or comments before we close this session?
Virginia?
Yeah.
That question reminded me, made me think about a comment that you made earlier about the tribal governments themselves engaging more directly with states and counties to maybe play a larger role. Can you say anything more about your thoughts about that? It felt like there was more that you could say.
I mean, I can say so many things. In general, we kind of best practice in Indian country, right, is that tribal governments are in the best position to provide services to tribal citizens. That is not surprising, right? They're there. They understand culturally. They're responsive, accountable to their communities, and kind of across the board, we see that the delivery of services improves when tribal governments are empowered to be a part of it, whether that's healthcare, criminal justice, education, kind of across the board. And so kind of trying to take that principle into election administration is an interesting question. I think that our thinking about that has I live and work in Washington, D.C. We're very focused on federal policy making. And so, some of what you'll see in the Native American Voter Rights Act is federal legislation that would empower tribes to, and basically by empower tribes, I mean require states to allow the tribes to choose, to identify a place on the reservation, to site polling places, voter registration, and those kinds of things, just the basic infrastructure at the most basic level. I think it's a conversation I'm really interested in having more tomorrow about, what are the various constraints under state law, what are the state policies and practices to bring tribes. There's kind of, the informal soft engagement of tribal governments. In other areas in which I work, a lot of this gets worked out through intergovernmental agreements. Whether it's cross-deputizations for tribal law enforcement and state law enforcement, there's a lot that can be done through negotiation and diplomacy between state and local governments and the tribal governments. And I think it's, to me, I suspect that approach would bear even more fruit than kind of a federal top-down approach. But I think it's a really interesting conversation to have. And I say it full well knowing that there's a lot of work to be done on the tribal side as well to make sure that the tribes are interested in coming to the table, or have the information they need to be good partners. But that's kind of what I was thinking. And I suspect that we do good. I thought we had run over, but now we still have 1 more minute. Do you have an online question? That's so exciting.
No.
It started to work, I think.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, perfect. It's very tiny. So 2 questions, or I guess maybe it's 3. I'm interested in how people make hope contagious given how detailed the day-to-day struggle has now become. How do we encourage people to understand more of the detail in order not to give up on the whole process? And then the second question from the same person, Ms. Davis. Also, would Kevin Killer be able to share his experiences about his campaign and promoting participation from within the legislature?
I guess, just really quick, in a couple of minutes. Thank you for the question, Ms. Davis. But, I think the biggest thing is the hope that you're talking about. I mean, unfortunately, Deb wasn't on, she was supposed to be on the panel, Deb Holland, but that's hope, like seeing the first Native woman one of two Native women in Congress, that is hope. And second, I think one of the biggest things that overcoming those barriers is, when I first ran, a lot of people didn't think I was going to get elected with the last name Killer, so there's all that, but also just overcoming that perception. And, I got elected when I was 29. I'm 38 right now, 39. I'm 39 right now. I got elected when I was 29. And it's just really making sure that, we clear those pathways for young people and setting those examples. And it doesn't, I think one of the cool things about the example that I shared is that, we had artists helping with these campaigns. We had artists contributing. We had everybody doing something. And I think that's one of the unique things about working in these levels is that, because of, young people, they were able to get me into office. But, we start speaking Lakota and introducing ourselves on the Senate floor. And our lieutenant governor actually spoke in Lakota back to us, and that was really unique to see that, especially in a state like South Dakota where they had crazy race relations, as OJ kept talking about, you hear that, and, we experience it. But just to kind of see that step going towards that. And we also have a state tribal relations day where a tribal president actually comes in, I think on the third day of the legislature, to address our state legislature. So those are little things to push for. I know North Dakota actually started that. So there's just little things like that, but just ensuring that, we get young people to run for office, because that's probably the most hope that we could give that generation is that, we just, we're there, young people are going to represent, they're going to do a good job, and, they're going to speak for their community and their generation, so.
Thank you, Kevin. And that's all that we have time for. I wanted to thank those of you who joined us online and here in the room, and of course, thank the panelists for sharing all of their insights. Thank you.